It's really great to be here, and you have a treat in store. This guy's very unusual. If you haven't already read the book, when you do, you will discover that it isn't a typical corporate tome, which can honestly put you to sleep in most cases, as I hope you don't know, because don't read those books, because they're terrible. This is not a terrible book. This is a real book. It's a book full of stories told by a practitioner at the cutting edge of some of the most complex and challenging and important issues that we all face as citizens, as Americans, and as humans. And that's what I'm so impressed by Brad about, because I'm a journalist who's tried to take that approach in my own work, and Techonomy, the company I run, is very much founded on the idea that tech is changing everything, and we got to get a grip on that, and we don't know how, but it could be super exciting because tech is and can make the world so much better. But it really is a breakthrough book, because these are issues everybody has to understand, and it's written from an insider. But it's not just an insider, it's a grown-up insider, which is actually fairly rare. If you look at the tech, the giants of tech, most of them are not led by grown-ups, unfortunately. And so here we have a grown-up who's co-leading with Satya, one of the great tech companies, who's been there forever and figured out a lot of stuff. And he's a storyteller working with Carol Ann. That they really did an amazing job bringing these complex issues to life. And so it ends up with a lot of urgent recommendations for all of us, but especially for the tech industry and government. But I sort of tell you why I think you wrote the book, but why did you write a book? Given you're so busy, you're the head of all legal stuff at Microsoft, you're the president, you help run the whole company, it's huge, global. Why take the time to write a book?
Well, I think you definitely captured a number of the reasons, David. And first, let me say it's great to be here, and thank you all for coming. The first reason is just technology has become so socially ubiquitous and is reshaping every aspect of not just our lives, but our societies around the world. It is a technology that is now both a tool and a weapon. That's why we chose that title. And when you think about the broad impact that it's having, the information isn't necessarily easily accessible to most people. There are some people that know a lot about tech, but not really about these policy issues. There are some people that know a lot about policy, but not about tech. But most of the world is not steeped in either, but affected by both. And so that's what we tried to do. And as you capture, thank you, we wanted to do it through stories. We didn't want to write another boring book. So the first goal is to get people to get to chapter 2 and then go to chapter 3. And make it interesting and even fun to read. But I also really thought hard. I mean, we both did. We didn't want this to be some, one more self-serving book. I don't think the world needs one more of those. So we really tried to step back and be more candid and introspective, something that I think is easier to do given the culture we have at Microsoft today. And frankly, when you've been around, I've been at the company for 26 years. You can afford to do that when you've been around longer in a way that might have been harder if I had been the first or second year in a new position.
Well, we'll get to so many ramifications of all that, but one of the reasons I've admired you since long before you wrote the book is that you are a straight shooter, and you really are a person of principle. And one of the ways that's been manifested in recent years was when Microsoft sued the US government to prevent itself from having to reveal the personal data of a customer whose data was held not on the premise, not in the United States, but in Ireland. And you said the US government does not have the right to demand us, just because we're an American company, to give them data held in Ireland. And you did that on a principled basis. You did lose. But
no, we went to the Supreme Court and settled and got a new law.
You settled,
passed.
right? That's what you did. Okay, sorry. But you had a lot of.
We've lost some other things, by the way.
Okay,
so.
well, I'm sorry I got the facts wrong there. I did read the book, and I generally know what's going on. But the reason I mention it is that it's a story you tell in the book, but it's one of so many stories in the book about how Microsoft had to respond to governmental action that was either stupid, ill-considered, illegal, or just problematic. Another great example being when, after Snowden revealed that the government was tapping into the servers of most major tech companies and just stealing data. And so there's all these stories about government misbehavior and confronting governments. How do you look at that as it's kind of as part of what the groundwork you lay in the book is explaining how that has been a big part of your work?
It has been, and it was a challenging thing to take on. We sort of start the book relatively early on by talking about the Snowden disclosures because, in our view, it was one of the two real inflection points this past decade in terms of the relationship between tech and governments around the world. And it was the classic sort of fog of war. As you read in the chapter, things were emerging, and we were learning about it from The Guardian and the Washington Post ourselves. But we did decide to take a stand, and when you work for a company, you're sort of ready to be sued by the government. You hope you won't be, but it happens, and of course, when you are, you have to defend yourself. To stand up and sue the government is very different. And so it was like crossing a Rubicon, and it connects with one of the really uncomfortable things that we grapple with every day, and we talk about it in the book, whether it's standing up to our own government or, say, responding to the Russian government with cyber attacks and the like. It's just a very different terrain in terms of how you manage these issues, but at the end of the day, you got to decide what is something worth standing up and fighting for. And in the Snowden case and in these other cases, we felt that there were important principles. In fact, I'd say there's a single unifying principle. If you put your customers first and you understand that in a cloud-based era, their data is in your data center and that you are the steward of their data, not the owner of it, then you realize you have a responsibility to protect it. And you have to protect it from that kind of surveillance or these kinds of cyber attacks. And then you just have to figure out how you're going to have the courage of your convictions and do it in an effective way so that if you fight battles, you hopefully win them.
But it also goes right to one of the key points you make repeatedly in the book, which is we really need to get into a new relationship between really three parties: government, business, and civil society, particularly the tech industry. So, because so many people say government doesn't get it, Zuckerberg went to Congress and they asked him stupid questions, et cetera, but you don't really believe that. Talk about what you think government does and doesn't understand, and what kind of relationship do we need between government and business?
Well, the first thing I would say is there's lots of smart people who work in government. And anybody who works in the tech sector that thinks that somehow people in government aren't smart enough to understand what we're doing is, I just think, fundamentally misguided. And just think about the world that we live in. If you drove a car here this morning, you drove a car that had certain safety standards because of government regulations. If you're getting on an airplane this weekend, you're going to get on an airplane that has safety standards. When you buy your food at the grocery store, there will be nutrition labels because of government rules. And if you take any kind of pharmaceutical product whatsoever, it's a product that was approved by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. So all of our lives depend on government understanding of food, drugs, automobiles, airplanes. And by the way, what is an automobile today? Well, it's becoming a computer on wheels. What is an airplane? It's becoming a computer with wings. What's the biggest computer issue of 2019 in terms of government regulation? I would actually argue that in some ways, it's the safety standards for software in the cockpit of an aircraft that have been grounded for months. Did anybody ever read a story that said, maybe these government people aren't smart enough to understand the software in these airplanes, so we should just have the government pull out of airplane regulation?
The problem with Boeing was they let Boeing take too much of it, right?
Yeah. So in every other area, the question is not whether people in government are capable of regulating technology, rather it's how do we ensure that people in government have the information and knowledge they need to regulate technology effectively. That's what we need, in my view, for digital technology writ large. And I will always argue that for those of us who work in the industry and who create technology, it actually is the best path for a long-term, sustainable, profitable course, because it is what will be needed to sustain the public's trust.
But so we need to get to a new place where government and the tech industry in particular have a more, ongoing dialogue. But how do we get there?
Well, I always think that whenever you have a problem, the first thing you serve yourself best by asking is, what can I do to contribute to a solution? That's not typically the way politics always works in America anymore. But look, if you start by saying, okay, what can I do? Well, so we'd say, look, first, we got to do a better job of sharing more information. We have to be more transparent. We've got to think about how we can work together, and that's why we're so enthusiastic about some of the initiatives that we've supported, that we talk about in the book, on a multilateral basis, with the Paris call, the Christchurch call, address cybersecurity, digital safety. And I think you need to propose ideas. I think if those of us who understand the technology best don't propose ideas, then we shouldn't be frustrated if people who understand it less well come up with something that won't work as well. I do believe we should propose ideas in a transparent way. We shouldn't just take big companies and put them into the back rooms of buildings in Washington, D.C. to hammer things out. But I think if we're prepared to offer ideas and be transparent, and then recognize that these things always will require compromise, we put ourselves on a path for a much more constructive solution.
Okay, well, that's what business should do. But one of the things that is, I think, most surprising in the book is the degree to which you basically endorse the idea of regulation as an overarching concept that the time has come that we cannot avoid, in a sense, almost across the board. And a great example of what you talk about there is the GDPR, the European privacy rules that came into effect last year, and how, and it is such a contrast, though, to pretty much every other major tech company that's in the news more. They seem to all be saying, no, 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 don't touch us. And you're saying GDPR is a really good thing. You talk a lot about advocating for a national privacy law in the US and not succeeding. So what should government do about you guys?
Well, I mean, first, I shared the fact that I gave a speech on Capitol Hill in D.C. in 2005, and we called for what I would describe as a strong national privacy law. And the rationale was straightforward. It had two parts. The first was, look, people are going to feel better about using technology if they trust it, and we shouldn't just expect people to trust the companies that make it. People's trust is always based on protection under the rule of law as well. And the second argument I made was, people ultimately are not going to want 50 states to have their own privacy laws. You got to get a federal act, and then think about the relationship with the states. And you're right, HP supported it. I think that was the only other company. No one else did. But it's why we also then talk about what I think is the second inflection point for tech this decade, and it was last year. It was Cambridge Analytica. I mean, that really overnight changed the public conversation in Washington, D.C.
But you call it the tech equivalent of 3 Mile Island.
Yeah, and for years had been saying there will be a 3 Mile Island for privacy. What does that mean? Well, 3 Mile Island was the nuclear power accident in Pennsylvania in 1979, and to me, one of the lessons was the nuclear power industry had not, in the 60s and 70s, engaged in a broad public discussion about the benefits and risks associated with nuclear power. So when 3 Mile Island happened, they were completely unequipped for it. And as a result, it would take 34 years before another nuclear power plant would be built in the United States, even while other countries in other parts of the world continued to move forward. And so I think, really to get back to your point, David, which I think is a good one, actually I would argue that since Cambridge Analytica, in just a year and a half, the United States has adopted what will be understood to be a de facto national privacy law. It's called the California Consumer Privacy Act. It was passed last year.
Right.
It's because 1 of every 8 Americans lives in California. And when you think in those terms, when it takes effect on January 1, every business in the country is going to have to decide, well, should I just implement these provisions for our customers in California, or should I do it nationwide? And immediately they're going to realize, oh, it's way too cumbersome and expensive to do it on a bifurcated basis. Let's just apply the California law to the nation. And I think the other thing that is so fascinating about the California statute is why and how it happened.
Please, because you were very involved in that.
We saw it and then got involved in, but the person who deserves the credit for this is a San Francisco real estate developer named Alastair McTaggart. And we really tell his story in the chapter on consumer privacy because we just think it's such an interesting story. Alastair made a lot of money in San Francisco real estate. He was right next door to Silicon Valley. He had a dinner at his home, and there was a Google engineer who came to dinner, and Alastair started quizzing him on how much information does Google have on me. And as he says, the engineer said, if you knew how much information we had about you, you would be terrified. And so he said, well, I'm going to do something about this. And this is where it's really interesting to think about the political geography of America. California, like Washington State, where we live, is among the states that was created in the sort of middle to late 1800s and created this process called an initiative. So even if you have a capital that cannot get something passed because of gridlock, you can take it to the ballot. So Alastair spent $3.5 million of his own money, collected double the number of signatures needed to get it on the ballot. It would have been on the ballot last November. He did polling. It's so interesting talking to him because he said the pollsters came back and said 82% of the public would support his initiative. He was disappointed. He said, like, why don't the other 18% support this? And the pollster said, you don't get it. We have never seen numbers like this. And to us, when we looked at it at Microsoft, we said, okay, the people get it. The public actually wants privacy to be protected. It's actually incredibly difficult, in my view, to craft an initiative that gets all the details right, because privacy has so many detailed rules. And so the goal last year, a goal which was achieved, was basically to say, okay, this is going on the ballot, now let's move it to the State House. And the California legislature adopted this law with literally hours to go before the legislative session expired. And now we're going to see a completely different privacy debate in this country. Within a week, a lot of businesses that for years had opposed a national privacy law said, we need a national privacy law. The reason is they, frankly, I think, wanted to weaken what had been protected in California and see if they could get Congress to override or preempt it, something that I don't think will be politically possible. So we now are in a different era, and it reflects the techlash of our times in part. But I think what it really reflects, and Alastair is the guy who says it best, people want to use these services. They don't want to give them up, but they want to have their privacy protected at the same time. And the only way to do that actually is to pass laws that protect privacy.
Well, just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen it reported, the Democrats and Republicans tried to come up with some kind of national bill that they could, but they failed, and now it's just too late. The California bill is going to basically preempt that. But then again, of course, if it's like auto emission standards, maybe the federal administration will try to do something there.
They might. I don't think they'll succeed. I think it's clearly established constitutionally that the states have the authority to regulate something.
They'll fail
like
on emission standards too.
I don't know what will happen on emission standards, but we live in this time when the number of issues that are being impacted in the world of tech is like changing on a weekly basis. You may all recall that the Federal Communications Commission under President Obama adopted net neutrality rules. Then the FCC abandoned those rules under President Trump. So that just went to the DC Circuit, the Federal Court of Appeals in Washington, DC. And while the Circuit Court upheld the FCC's right to drop its own rules, the court also held that the states do have the constitutional authority to impose their own net neutrality rules. Washington State was the first state to adopt state net neutrality rules. This was something that we at Microsoft supported as a company. And so I actually think one of the interesting questions politically on a lot of these issues is, look, you know, if you can get New York and California, add Washington and Massachusetts, say Illinois, to adopt state rules, then even if Congress doesn't act, the real question that people in Congress have to ask themselves is, are they still relevant? Because I think that, you know, the economy of the country will largely snap in many ways to what states that have a substantial part of the population enact.
Well, you're a deep believer in rationality, which we could discuss separately, but I want to stick on privacy for a little while because I really want to look at in a little more depth at why Microsoft is different from much of the industry on this. And I want to also get to the issue of facial recognition, which you write about quite eloquently and at some length. But it also, I guess the way to kind of get at that, to throw a few things together, you know, you guys were prosecuted by the federal government for antitrust very aggressively a long time ago. And you fought it hard, and you know, Bill Gates was famously obnoxious in the depositions, et cetera, et cetera. But you came out the other side of that. In a sense, did that form the modern Microsoft in a way that in the end turns out to be healthy?
I think there's something to that. I mean, I think we always have to be quick to say, look, I don't think we're smarter than anybody else. You know, and hopefully we're not dumber than anybody else either. Yeah, but I like to say we were the first graduates of this new school of hard knocks. And it was the school that we were forced to attend starting in the late 1990s with the big antitrust cases. People forget that the Department of Justice and 20 states, including the state of California, sought to break Microsoft up, even won a court order to break Microsoft up. And you know, my job at the time was to sort of ultimately try to bring peace to that. Actually, I sort of started in some ways in Sacramento. I'd go to Sacramento and meet with Bill Lockyer when he was the Attorney General there, and he was one of the most formidable foes of Microsoft, and just start to talk about, you know, what does the future look like? And I think from that experience, what I definitely came away learning was, look, you got to start by just understanding why people who are concerned about you, in fact, are concerned about you. I think one of the fascinating things in life is when we look at ourselves in the mirror in the morning, we go, hey, I'm ready for the day. I look pretty good. And the moment someone sends you a photo that's been taken of you, you go, I don't like that photo. I don't look good at all there. You know, you sort of have to learn to look at yourself the way you do in a photograph, not in the mirror. You have to see what other people see in you, not what you see in yourself. And inevitably, it's a more mixed bag. But that's really the origin, I think, of you know, what it takes to navigate the world.
But do you think that's partly why you come out differently from a lot of the other giant tech companies on matters like privacy, AI, regulation, and such?
Yes, I mean, I do. I think it definitely plays a role because, you know, at bottom, our view is, look, if we're not understanding the problems that technology is creating, if we're not acknowledging them explicitly, and if we're not working to solve them with other people, then we ultimately will fail. And we're going to fail to serve the people we create this technology for in the first place. So let's get on with it, and let's have these conversations, and let's open ourselves up to new possibilities, rather than just say, hey, we've got it right, we're smarter, people don't understand us, you know, please go away.
And for any of you who don't follow business news and the stock markets, one thing Microsoft is not doing is failing. Microsoft is financially just, you know, it's up there with Apple, in many ways beyond Apple in terms of its just general trajectory of success. You know, is market cap still over $1 trillion? I don't know.
I
It
haven't
was
checked
for a
today,
while. I haven't
but
checked
for the
it.
last several months, we've been the most valuable company.
One of the only, I think only you and Apple have ever crossed that $1 trillion line.
I think Amazon did for a
Oh,
couple of
Amazon
days,
did
but
too.
we've been
But
above
Amazon's
it.
under it again now. But I think, but let's talk about AI, because
Yeah.
you talk about it in a lot of length in the book for good reason, and talk about how government really has to get involved. And you also talk a lot about facial recognition as sort of the symbolic manifestation of it in society right now. Can you just talk about some of that?
Yeah, well, first of all, we look at a lot of things through a historical lens. That's one of the reasons we actually have a number of historical stories in the book, that we think there's a lot that can be learned from them. And so the first thing we would say is, I think artificial intelligence is going to reshape the economies of the world over the next 3 decades, much the way the combustion engine did in the first half of the 20th century. It will change everything. So the first thing we really try to do in the book is just sort of bring it to life and make it easier to understand. What is it, how it works, why is it taking off now in terms of the technologies that enable it. But then you get to, I think, one of the, I'll just say, look, in some ways you could say that the 2 most important questions for all of us who are alive today are, number one, are we going to do what it takes to build a healthier planet so that it's sustainable for the generations that follow? And are we going to address what we are the first generation of humanity to create? Machines that can make decisions that previously have only been made by people. And when you think about this second question, first of all, we're often struck, it's why we weave into the book, Hollywood has had a profound impact on how America and the world thinks about artificial intelligence. Why? Because Hollywood has produced so many successful movies that are basically the story of humanity creates machine, machine makes decision, the machine destroys humanity. You know, that's sort of, it seems to be like we're going to have, what, the 5th Terminator movie? So it almost doesn't matter what decade you were born in, you've probably seen a Terminator movie. And so this is actually a question that is on people's minds in the general public. It's like, what are you all about to do to us? But in a very serious and even profound way, I think it really calls on us to ask, what are the ethical rules that will govern the decisions that artificial intelligence-based machines make? And we do talk about that, and then we see facial recognition as, in many ways, being the very first specific issue where, you know, the rubber is meeting the road. We're having to work through this.
There's so many things to ask you about, and I want you guys to enter in very shortly, so be thinking of what you would say or ask. I mean, you talk about meetings. I mean, this is what's so great. This guy meets with Obama, with the Pope, with Trump, and he tells the stories about what happens there, and many of them are pretty interesting things. But given what you just said, there's one quote that I found, it was sad and bizarre that a sentence like this needs to be written, but it's good that you did it. You have this sentence in the book that says, decision-making about war and peace needs to be reserved for humans. You know, it's like, what? Does that really have to be said? But it does, right?
It does. It's a fascinating one. You know, if facial recognition is the first concrete controversy, I think autonomous weapons, lethal autonomous weapons, are the second. And people are asking, you know, gee, you know, are we going to see, you know, weapons driven by machines deciding who to fire upon, who to kill, and the like? And what I find really interesting, among many things about this issue, is it is a classic one that calls on bringing different communities of people together. You've got people in the human rights community that have really important things to think about, to say in this space. And then you have the militaries of the world. And oftentimes, these are not communities that interact with each other, but we interact with both. The first thing you realize is that they often are talking about the same things, but they're not speaking the same language. And so until you develop this common vocabulary, you can't bring people together. But one of the things I've found, especially I've met with military leaders around the world, it doesn't even matter what country, if I say, look, we don't want to wake up in the morning and find that machines started a war while we were sleeping. And you'll have these very senior generals who will say, yeah, absolutely not, that's our job. We're the ones who are responsible for war and peace. But I do think it is absolutely right, to go back and think about this. I mean, it's another reminder. We actually refer explicitly to the fact in our book, we tell the story of War Games. War Games was one of the first movies that put into the public consciousness the fact that machines could start a war if they're not managed properly by human beings.
You also talk a lot about this, the general concept of accountability being one of the things that we really need to focus on more. You talk about the accountability of machines to humans, and that kind of goes to the facial recognition challenges, which we actually didn't dwell on enough yet probably, but we may not have time. And then you also talk about the accountability of creators, especially engineers, to society, and you say great things about all that. But I think we should see if people in the audience have things they want to ask or say, and I can certainly throw in more questions.
Okay, just real quick. Questions around here typically begin with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are generally short. There's no such thing as a two-part question, and this morning only David gets to ask the follow-up question.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if you could talk about how you differentiate the skills that are needed or the executive capacity for success in the external environment versus the internal environment. And what do you look for when you're filling a key role at Microsoft?
Great question, and I'd offer a couple of thoughts. The first, something we talk about in the book, is traditionally the most successful people at tech companies have been steeped in things like computer science, maybe data science, maybe engineering. And yet, one of the things to really focus on is the fact that as we enter an AI-based world and you're trying to empower computers to think like people, you actually need people who are more broad-minded. If you come out of the technical side, you really have to have some background in other liberal arts. I think we're going to have...
Which most technical people don't have.
Exactly, traditionally. And I think we're going to have more people who come from the liberal arts, albeit people who are also steeped in technology to some degree. So that's the first thing. We need to be more broad-minded. The second thing I would say is when you think about the breadth of what you need to be able to grapple with, then what you really recognize is that the single most important attribute is a desire to keep learning. If there's one thing that I've been so struck by, whether it's working with a Bill Gates or a Steve Ballmer or a Satya Nadella or other tech leaders, or I'll just say like an Angela Merkel.
You talk about the meets like they're one of many, but actually...
Yeah, no, but all these people that you read about that have been enormously successful and, I would argue, have typically been sort of among the leaders in a broadly respected way. They all have this amazing curiosity. As soon I describe a little bit the meeting that Satya and I had with Chancellor Merkel in her office. Oh my gosh, she just sat down and she's just starting to quiz us. How's this changing? How's Germany compared to Europe? How's Europe compared to the United States? Question after question. So what we really need to instill is a thirst and an ability to keep learning. But the last thing I would say that is so interesting is in 2019, there's not much of a division between internal and external. In a world where everybody can be a publisher on the internet with audio, video, or the written word, it just changes the nature of discourse. And mostly that's for the better. I mean, it still is the case that if you really want to work through a hard problem, you want people to be able to brainstorm together and not have some idea that may not last more than 10 minutes end up, in some prominent place. But we've all really had to, navigate a new world and navigate a new world with a new generation of people, new generation of employees that have heightened expectations about their employer. That's one of the things we talk about. Employee activism is actually an important part of the culture of many tech companies, especially on the West Coast. So you have to really think about how to navigate that and how you want your culture to accommodate that.
But we've heard so much about employee activism, and you do not condemn it. You actually, sort of welcome it, more or less.
Yeah, the point that we make in the book is something that I've long believed. People may not have the right answers, but they may be asking the right questions. And so you start to ask, well, why are they raising this? What are the questions? What are the problems they're asking us to solve? And the other phrase, that's a phrase I've loved using inside Microsoft, especially with our lawyers for many years, is the best response to a half-baked idea is not necessarily to kill it. That's almost what lawyers are trained to do, go kill all the half-baked ideas. If there's a half-baked idea, figure out how to finish baking it. I think a lot of our best ideas started out as half-baked ideas. And this is where you do have to create the space and give people the time to develop that based on curiosity, but insulate them a bit from what can be the turning of the guns on the ideas, both internally and externally.
Good morning. Oh, okay. You've talked quite a bit about how Microsoft is encouraging the U.S. to, add more regulations. What is Microsoft doing to have that kind of impact across the world?
Well, we're taking our ideas around the world. When I think about what it takes to bring legal change in laws and regulation around the world today, I typically start with the proposition that your best place for success is not going to be Washington, D.C. I'll share a conversation I had with a U.S. senator a few months ago, a person who I think has great ideas for technology. And I said, you will never get these ideas adopted if you just bring them to the floor of the Senate or the House. It's just not going to move fast enough. But I said, look what's happening around the world. What I describe is some of our work with Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand in the wake of the Christchurch terrorist attack. And what's really interesting is that the law has started to change, but the way the law has started to change in terms of imposing more obligations on tech companies is it moved from New Zealand to Australia to the United Kingdom to France to Germany, and then it'll move back to Washington. So that's where we're seeing legal change. We're seeing Europe in a leadership role. As much or more than anything, we think this is a time where we should be thinking about how technology needs to serve democratic principles. You bring together the world's democratic governments. There's 76 of them, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit. And you really pursue a deliberative strategy, and you hope to bring the U.S. on board. But at a time when the U.S. is not prepared to get on board, you just don't worry about it. You create the new consensus, and then you come back to D.C.
Wow. Is it okay if people identify themselves? I'd like to know who people are.
Okay. Good morning, Brad. Thanks for sharing the story.
And who are you?
Steve Reisner with Lift Innovate. One question which kind of follows on what you were talking about before is, how do you see companies evolving as we now have, people and chief people officers, but yet technology is still kind of managed the AI. But as we start to blend this, how do companies start to kind of blend the organization to kind of manage this as one, or how do you see that changing?
It's a great question, and one way to think about it is sort of what does the org chart look like at a tech company in the future? And there's a number of things that I think have served us at Microsoft well this decade. One of them, interestingly, was a change that was made by Steve Ballmer in his last year as CEO. He basically said, look, I want to have a stronger functional model, and Satya has retained it. And by that he means we are going to have engineering groups that create the products, rather than give to this broad group every discipline and responsibility to think about every dimension of the products it's creating. But then we're going to have a business development team, an HR team, a finance team. Our team is corporate external legal affairs. And what you then need to think about is the following. You need world-class teams in every function. Traditionally, in many parts of the tech sector, there were world-class teams in engineering or engineering in sales. But these other functions were almost second-class citizens. And so you have to say, no, no, no. All these teams really need fantastic people who can together think broadly. And then the second thing you need to do is ensure that while people respect each other's roles, that you actually have role clarity, people do work on issues together. If everybody's just in their silo and they're not working as part of a single team on a specific question, then I think this functional model breaks apart. One of the things that is interesting about Microsoft, say the last 5 years, is that our senior leadership team typically spends 6 hours of one day a week in a meeting going through things, and sometimes it's 8 hours. And I will admit, most people don't get up in the morning and say, I just hope I can go to an 8-hour meeting today. That would just be so much fun. So it's actually hard, and it's even hard on people's calendars given the competing demands on their time. But it really forges the kind of teamwork and cross-disciplinary reasoning that you need in order to think these things through. It served us well. I'll never say, if it served us well, it'll serve everybody well. But it's definitely served us not only well, but I think much better than I would have predicted, perhaps anybody would have predicted 6 or 7 years ago when we embarked on it.
Good morning, Brad. Celeste, Microsoft. So as someone who works with youth all the time, I'm very concerned about the future for youth. And as someone who knows this very well, I'd like to hear what your advice is for young people, how to set themselves apart, how to really break out of the norm, to really shine as in an environment that is increasingly competitive.
No, it's a great question. I mean, I actually think it's a lot harder to be a young person today than when I was a young person. And I was a young person, who grew up in a middle-income family in the middle of the country with the most common name in the middle of the phone book, Smith. The first thing I would say is, it's disturbing to actually see how access to the fundamental skills for the future, things like coding and computer science, are inequitably accessible today. We have a chapter on the talent gap, and one of the things that we point out is that the people who are taking coding courses, or say the AP computer science course in America today, are more male, more white, more urban, and more affluent than the nation as a whole. So, as technology skills increasingly translate into the best jobs, there's a real danger that the lack of access to these skills will exacerbate all of these other divides. So, the first thing, I would say is, focus on the skills of the future, but do it in a broad-minded way. Recognize that learning to code is something that'll be important, but the ability to think more broadly, as we were talking about, ethics, these other things, I think that is going to be of fundamental importance. Obviously, I think we need to figure out how to reach those communities that are the least privileged. This is where I think you see, populism being driven in cities where people see communities being left behind, and you see populism being driven in rural areas where rural people feel left behind. And while they actually go to opposite ends of the political spectrum in the solutions they advocate, their fundamental assessment of the problems is often quite similar. And I think sort of really rooting ourselves, grounding ourselves in why people feel left behind. Usually I find it's because they are being left behind, and societally trying to get at all of those issues. And then I think there's another interesting dimension that we touch upon in the chapter on social media. And I think it's a question for anybody who's a parent or grandparent or a teenager. There are many paradoxes about technology. One of the technology paradoxes we describe is that every technology that has ever been created that brings people closer together has also divided people apart. we described the impact of the automobile in rural America a century ago. People could drive to other places, and then, of course, once they did that, they spent less time in their local school or their local church or their local community. And so you saw this change in the social fabric of rural communities. For those of us who grew up when homes started to have more landline phones, you suddenly lived in a time where if you were a teenager, you could have a phone in your bedroom. That was me. And it was like, oh, I'm happy to go to my bedroom. I'm going to close the door and get on the phone with my friend. But I'm not going to talk to my sister as much, and I'm not going to talk with my parents as much. And then you think about how the smartphone, okay, you no longer go to your room. You see these,
Sit at the dinner table with your family.
Yeah, and to me, I think, it'll be interesting. Will a sociologist 100 years from now look at these photographs of like 5 teenagers sitting next to each other or 5 family members sitting next to each other, all interacting with their phones and maybe people somewhere else, but not each other? And that's the paradox of technology. It connects people who are far apart, but in so doing can divide people that are close together. And then you look at the bubbles, what we, as we call them, the cyber tribes, in social media. This is, I think, one of the great questions of our time for how to work with young people, and not just young people. I think we all sort of have to think about it for ourselves. And it's one of these new issues that I just sort of sense is beginning to take off in terms of how we're thinking and talking about it. I think it will be, a challenge we're all talking about more. And frankly, there'll be more data about the impact of all of this that we'll want to learn from. I don't think that's a great answer because it's a hard problem, but those are a few thoughts.
Hello. Thank you so much, Brad and David, for having the conversation. My name is Dan Pierce, and I run a company called Mentally Fit. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is how technology can connect people, like you were saying, from all over the world for real connections, not just surface connections. But I know a big concern for a lot of people is the addictive nature of some technology and just how it can disconnect us in ways. So is this something that Microsoft has any initiatives for, and is this something that you see as important going forward?
Well, I definitely think it's important going forward. We have some initiatives, others do too, and I suspect 10 years from now, we'll look back and say, okay, we were just getting started. Certainly the kinds of initiatives to use data. First, inform people. Apple's done a nice job in this space, I think. Measure your screen time. Know what you're doing. We have similar things. Use some self-discipline. Create tools so that people can say, hey, I don't want to do this for more than X minutes a day. I like some of our analytics tools, for example, really designed more for the workplace, but analytics tools that help you know how you're using your time. To what extent are you bombarding your employees with emails late at night? I'm guilty of that one. To what extent are you interacting with different groups of people? Fascinating data that just shows clusters of communities and are they connecting with each other or not? And so I think these are all really important initiatives, but it just sort of, I think, it takes us back to a starting point. One of the points that Carol Ann would often make as we were working on the book and thinking about these issues is you always have to start by knowing what problem you're trying to solve. And I think that's actually good if you're creating a technology product. If it's not a problem that people care about, then your product's probably not going to matter. And the problems that matter most are always about people. They are human problems. And the thing that's changed is that the technology itself is creating a new generation of human problems. And now we need technology to help solve the human problems that technology is creating. And I think you're focused on the right question, by asking it the way you did. And I've just got to believe that there's a huge amount of creativity ahead.
Hello, my name is Carla Torres. I run community development for our Microsoft retail marketing team here in Los Angeles. One of the questions that I have is also around AI, and how are we going to combat the adverse effects that AI could have, especially with things like facial recognition and biases on our Black and Brown community specifically?
Well, to me, there has never been an issue in the quarter of a century that I've been involved in the tech sector that has exploded politically like facial recognition. I think that in itself is fascinating. It's worth just reflecting on. Because we wrote a blog, I authored it just last July and said, hey, this is a problem we're going to need new laws to address. And there were a lot of people in Silicon Valley who said, like, why are you doing this? Why are you talking about this? There's no problem here. But I think quickly people have changed their conversation. There is a real bias problem. It's been well documented. Facial recognition has higher error rates for women and people of color. I actually think in the scheme of facial recognition problems, it's likely to be the one we'll solve sooner rather than later. But it does require real work by tech companies. And it's where we think that a law should, in effect, say that if you're going to be in this business, you've got to make your service available for testing, so you would create the consumer reports of facial recognition, if you will. I think that some of the other issues are much deeper, which is not to minimize the bias issue. But when you think about the potential use of facial recognition to enable mass surveillance, we're already seeing this happen in some parts of the world. It really means technologically we are on the cusp of making possible the kind of future that George Orwell warned about 70 years ago in his book 1984. And so we've adopted internal policies that are designed to ensure that our technology is not used in that way. But what we really need is a standardized approach across the industry and ultimately a recognition, I'll say starting with the world's democratic governments, that there need to be clear limits on how facial recognition is used to protect against this. That won't in and of itself stop the world's authoritarian governments from using facial recognition for this purpose. But if you can build this consensus across the tech sector, at least in most of the world, if you can get governments to come together and say, no, this is a bad thing, we first protect that part of the world, and you perhaps start to create the basis for the dialogue that will be needed with other countries.
And you do talk about several instances where Microsoft has turned down very lucrative contracts in order to not work with autocrats who would surveil their nations and not to empower police departments to do things that probably would be discriminatory. So thank you for that. But I have two last questions I want to ask you. The first one, since there's so many things about this book that are sort of an exhortation to the tech industry itself, how has the book been received so far by executives and in other companies and other companies generally in the community?
So far so good. It's been available for less than a month, so it's still early days. I'm definitely getting lots of feedback from, I'll just say, the rank and file of the tech sector, and then we'll see what the reaction is among more senior leaders. It was interesting because we wrote this book to be candid, but we didn't want to throw other people under the bus, because the goal is...
That's not your style.
No, look, if you're going to try to build an effort that brings people together, I mean, like who wants to get hammered over the head and then join that parade? So...
Something else you learn being an older guy.
Yeah.
Basically.
It doesn't mean that any company is immune from a certain level of criticism in the book. What we really tried to make sure is that we were as or more critical of ourselves than anybody else, and we combine criticism with praise. So, you probably won't be surprised that when I talk to the folks at Amazon who are just cross town from us in Seattle, I say, did you see that part in the book where we really called out Amazon?
Several times.
But we say, like, in the wake of Christchurch, Amazon got involved. They became part of the solution. And we specifically say they deserve great praise for that because their services were not used the way, say, Facebook or YouTube were. They could have just said, hey, we're not part of the problem, we're not going to be part of the solution. And yet we say, hey, Amazon deserves great credit because they decided they could be part of the solution even though they weren't part of the problem. And that's the civic ethic that we think tech needs to embrace. And there are some tech companies that are embracing that, and there are some tech companies that are not. And I will admit that there are days when I'm like so close to wanting to just sort of name names and go, will you guys finally work with the rest of us to solve some of these problems?
Let us do that. We'll do
Yeah.
that. We journalists do that.
Yeah,
It's pretty easy to say which ones they are.
But yeah, and so what you always, one of the aspects of human nature is I think you're likely to forget 10 nice things that were said about you before you forget the one piece of criticism that you heard. I think that's the way most of us are. So trying to sort of counter that and hope that we'll break through. People are listening. I do think that's true.
Can I ask one more, Ted?
You can.
So, you've been out talking about the book now for a little while. You've heard a lot, you've had a lot of conversations like this with audiences in public, a lot of people in private. Now that you've done it, you've touched on so many key issues. What is that you wish you had written that you didn't? What would you have liked to have put in this book now that you look back on it?
Well, it's a great question, and one of the interesting challenges in writing it is, frankly, the terrain keeps changing underneath us so quickly. We don't have a chapter that takes the antitrust issues head on, and that would have been a logical thing to add given the way those issues have evolved. We deal with it in pieces, but not directly, so that probably would have been a sensible thing to do. I will say one of the things that you discover on a book tour, and this was the first one that we had ever done, is actually what resonates with people around the country. And what we've found is that two issues have tended to resonate more than any other. One, even in major cities, is the lack of broadband availability in rural communities. Because everybody sort of looks at the political map and you see all these red counties. Well, I think our book, and that chapter in particular, helps explain why. And then when you tell people that that we just take for granted technology that other people just don't have. They have no broadband connectivity, and then you take them through the impact of that and what we can do. People get really engaged on that, even in like a Los Angeles or a New York or a Washington, D.C. The other thing that really gets everybody's attention that I've found is something we spend a few chapters on, and that's the threats to democracy from cyber attacks. Hacking of emails, disinformation, potential tampering with voting, and the need to think about that with an eye towards 2020. And especially when as we do, put that in the context of some of the historical stories. This actually was first experienced by the United States when George Washington was president. And when you talk about it that way, people do say, okay, I get it. We're arguing about lots of things in this country, but we do need to find a way to come together to protect our voting systems. So in some ways, I come away thinking, I wish we had done a little bit more of this. But mostly I come away thinking that there is hope, that there is a broad appreciation that some of these issues actually are far deeper than technology. That when you think about globalization, trade, immigration, income inequality, they're actually connected to what's happening in technology, and some of the solutions may be as well.
Well, this may be the last thing you want to hear considering you've got a company to run, but I hope you write more because this is a very unusual thing you've done and you bring an indispensable perspective to it. So write another book, or at least write a lot of articles, because these issues do come so fast. You talk about speed as one of our biggest problems, so help us keep understanding it. And thank you so much, Brad.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you, Brad.